In this video, I'll introduce 7 steps you can use to develop a theoretical framework for empirical research. Following these 7 steps, you should be able to start building your theoretical framework. When I was a graduate student, I was puzzled by the theoretical framework as I wrote research articles. I didn't understand what it meant back then. I asked around, but nobody could give me a straightforward answer or an answer that I could comprehend. I wondered if there was a list of theories that I could choose from to develop my theoretical framework. I didn't find any in my field, so I created my own list. For years, whenever I came across theories or constructs as I read empirical articles, I added them to my own list of theories and theoretical constructs. That was when I became interested in theories. Over the years of my own research, I got better at developing theoretical frameworks and began to propose my own theoretical frameworks. Like most of the things in literature, there is rarely an agreed upon definition on anything in social sciences. It is common to see arguments that one definition is better than another, so not everyone agrees with the definitions I use in this video. If you think a better definition should be used, you can leave your comments below. For a start, what is a theoretical framework exactly? First, theoretical framework and conceptual framework are used interchangeably. Again, not everyone agrees with me, as some scholars argued the two terms are different. For simplicity reasons, I use the term theoretical framework throughout this video. A theoretical framework should have at least 2 elements: constructs and the relationship among them. Your theoretical framework can have only one theory, which includes constructs and relationships. Your theoretical framework can also have multiple theories. Either way, you can consider your theoretical framework as a house. The constructs in your theoretical framework is like a pile of stones. Dumping a pile of stones is not enough. To build a house, you need to put stones together meticulously. In empirical research, how you put those constructs together comes from how the theories propose the relationship among the constructs and how the existing empirical evidence suggests those relationships. This is why in empirical research articles, the section of literature review is integrated into the section of theoretical frameworks, sometimes with a subsection of hypothesis development. If your research brings significant theoretical contribution to the field, you usually cannot find an existing theoretical framework in the literature. This is like building a house. If you don't want your house to be just one more house, you make efforts to put those stones, which are constructs, together by drawing up on existing theories and literature. Here are the 7 steps you can follow to develop your theoretical framework for empirical research. Step number 1. Write down your topic of interest, problem statement, and research questions. What's the topic you'd like to study? What's the problem statement? What research questions do you want to ask? And then use the data you will collect to find the answers. For example, if you're interested in the topic of motivation, how motivation works, how to motivate people, why do people do the things they do? Your problem statement could be how to motivate a group of people with different personalities and experiences to work together. Your research questions could be, why is it so difficult for some people to get along at work? And why some people purposely sabotage team members' efforts, such as withholding an important piece of information for decision-making at the expense of the group interest? At this first step, your research questions don't have to be perfect. In fact, there are no perfect research questions out there, as we can always ask better research questions. What you write down at this stage is just to put your thoughts into words to get you started with an empirical research study that is driven by theories. Step number 2, find relevant theories and constructs. How to find relevant theories and constructs? You'll need to know at least the mainstream literature in your field. That's exactly what I did when I was a new scholar. I first identified the top journals in my field, which was educational leadership. I then looked into every published empirical article in those journals, starting from the most recent ones to the earlier ones. I wrote down what theories or theoretical constructs were used in the theoretical framework. I also included the definitions of those constructs. If different authors defined constructs differently, I pay special attention to them, because if I choose one definition in my study, I'll need to justify why this specific definition fits my study. Later in my research career, I don't just keep track of the theories and constructs in my own field, I also pay attention to the theories and constructs in other fields, such as administrative science, decision-making, artificial intelligence, and neuroscience. In a research course I teach, I provide my students with a workbook which includes all major theories in the field of educational leadership. So that's the tool my students use to start building their theoretical framework. If your topic of interest is how to motivate a group of people with different personalities and experiences to work together, then the relevant constructs could be motivation, personality, expertise, and power. As you read literature of motivation, you find 3 motivating forces: the implicit power motive, which is people's unconscious desire for power; the implicit affiliation motive, which is people's non-conscious concern for establishing, maintaining, and restoring close personal relationship with others. And the third motivating force is the implicit achievement motive. So you add these 3 constructs to your list. By the way, there are many other theories on motivation. You then read literature on power and note some scholars differentiate power from status. Power is an asymmetrical control over resources. If a school principal has power over teachers, it means the principal has more control over teachers, such as through job evaluation, which is tied to how teachers are paid. But status refers to prestige and respect. Unlike power, status relies on the judgment of others. People can have high power but low status, such as prison guards, TSA agents, and DMV workers. Individuals who don't have a high status but have a lot of power may express their resentment, and they're more motivated than high status individuals to demean others. That power they have frees them to do so. With all these findings in the literature, you now add the constructs of power and status to your list. You then think, if power is a motivating force, how to encourage leaders to share their power with others? So you add empowerment to your list of constructs. The more research literature you read, the more constructs you end up with. Step number 3. What theories predict the relationship among the constructs? Now that you get the stones, which are the constructs you need to build a house, which is your theoretical framework, the next step is to put those stones together. How? Do you put them randomly? If it is that easy, everyone can build a house. You need to pay attention to the shapes, colors, textures of the stones. It's the same as you develop a theoretical framework. You read the literature and find how theories predicted the relationships of the constructs. You cannot just flip a coin and decide the relationships among the constructs. The predicted relationships must be grounded in theories and literature. For example, you want to know the theories that predicted the relationships between leadership and organizational performance. After reading the literature, you find out there are two competing theories that explain this relationship between leadership and organizational performance. Both theories were proposed in the 1970s and 1980s. One theory is strategic leadership, which considers that leaders' characteristics such as knowledge, experience, values, personalities, and preferences greatly influence what happens to their organizations. The competing theory is institutional theory, which explains why organizations are so similar regardless of what the leaders are. According to institutional theory, leaders have little impact because organizations are exceedingly resistant to change, swept along by external forces and constrained by conventions and norms. There is also empirical evidence supporting it. One of the studies that support institutional theory is titled School Superintendents Vital or Irrelevant? Superintendents are visible public officials who are expected to be responsible for the performance of their school district. They play a prominent role in the public imagination and are courted and paid as if they matter. However, the authors find little evidence suggesting a direct correlation between district performance outcomes and the superintendent's paycheck. There is a direct quote from the report. Superintendents whose tenure is associated with sizable, statistically reliable changes in student achievement in the district in which they serve, controlling for the many other factors that affect student achievement, are quite rare. The report authors added, in the end, it is the system that promotes or hinders student achievement. Superintendents are largely indistinguishable. So the two theories, strategic leadership and institutional leadership, make different predictions on the same constructs. Strategic leadership says there is a relationship, and institutional theory says there is little relationship there. What would you do? You can review more literature, and it's likely you'll find the literature and empirical evidence supporting either theory. Another way to try to resolve the conflicts of mixed findings is to examine the assumptions of those theories. Step number 4. What are the assumptions of the theories listed above? For example, the upper echelons theory was developed on the assumption of bounded rationality. It is the idea that complex, uncertain situations are not objectively knowable, but are merely interpretation. So feeding different leaders the same information, you get different decisions. This is because different leaders process the same information differently with their own knowledge, experience, values, personalities, and preferences. Another example is the construct of data-driven decision-making, which has its theoretical root in rational choice theory. Data-driven decision-making assumes, at least implicitly, that the same data are interpreted by different people in a similar way. So feeding people the same data, you should be able to get the same decisions. Another assumption is that emotions do not play a role in how people process data and use data to reach a decision, or emotions play a negative role in decision making. As the saying goes, don't allow emotions to cloud your judgment. But do those assumptions hold? One more example. Shared leadership explains leadership from the perspective that leadership is distributed among team members rather than a perspective that focuses on a single designated leader. There are other terms that bear similar meanings, including team leadership, distributed leadership, and participative leadership. The assumption is that if leaders share their decision-making power and employees participate in decision-making, the team will be more productive and employees will feel empowered. But the problem is, do these assumptions hold? Step number 5, do the assumptions hold? What is missing? From steps 1 to 4, you build on the existing knowledge base in your field. At step 5, you begin to challenge the status quo in your field. If you do well in this step, your research has the potential to become seminal work and even a breakthrough in your field. To do so, you ask the questions, do the assumptions of the theories in step 4 hold? What is missing in the current theories? What constructs need to be added to the existing theories? What roles do the added constructs play? Is the added construct a mediator or moderator? For example, there are merits of transactional leadership. One of them is the assumption that leaders must first be seen to advance the group interest and win the respect of followers before the leaders do new things. Another assumption is that leaders invest energy in the group, and conversely, followers do their leaders' bidding when both parties perceive their transactions to be satisfactory. However, transactional leadership assumes that every behavior can be counted as a cost or benefit, which is not true at all times. Transactional leadership also assumes that leaders and followers are equal parties in the transaction, which is not true because leaders have more power to reward and punish followers. Another example is data-driven decision-making or evidence-based decision-making. It assumes that people process the same data and evidence in exactly the same way. This assumption does not hold. In my video about framing effect, I talked about how the options are framed could change people's decision-making. Here is an experiment reported by Tversky and Kahneman in their article titled Rational Choice and the Framing of Decisions. In their experiment, participants were more likely to approve administering a drug if they were told that the drug has a 90% survival rate than 10% death rate. Rationally speaking, the 90% survival rate and the 10% death rate provide the same evidence. But people respond differently to how the data are presented. The framing effect is associated with the brain activity in the amygdala, which is the brain region associated with processing emotions, particularly negative emotions such as fear and anxiety. As a result, when a problem is framed as a loss versus gain, people respond more strongly to avoid losses. So the assumption that people process the same data and the same evidence in exactly the same way does not hold. After evaluating assumptions of theories, you then ask the questions, what is missing in the current theories? If yes, what constructs need to be added to the existing theories? What roles do the added construct play? Is the added construct a mediator or a moderator? For example, sense-making is a construct in educational leadership. It refers to peoples or groups use prior experiences and knowledge to navigate ambiguous situations, make sense of information, and decide how to respond. But what are specific psychological and social processes that leaders process the information? What are the mental processes that leaders navigate ambiguity? By the way, in the literature of judgment and decision making, ambiguity means probability unknown. So, if leaders don't know the probability of an event, then how do they make sense of it exactly? When it comes to how leaders' characteristics and experiences are converted into their decisions, it still remains largely a mystery. This presents an opportunity for you to find the answer in your research. Recall an earlier example about the two competing theories about the relationship between leadership and organizational performance. Strategic leadership says there is a relationship, but institutional theory says there is little relationship there. What would you do? How would you resolve the conflict here? Or how would you make sense of it? To reconcile the two competing views, Hambrick and his team introduced a construct as a moderator to either amplify or mitigate a relationship between leadership and organizational outcomes. This new construct is called managerial discretion. They argue that the two competing views are conditionally valid, depending on the managerial discretion, which means latitude of action. Discretion can come from environmental conditions, such as the coronavirus pandemic. Discretion can also come from organizations, such as whether a weak school board or a demanding, aggressive school board can greatly influence leaders' discretion. The third source of discretion comes from leaders themselves. For example, whether a leader has a high tolerance for ambiguity or not. If there is a great deal of managerial discretion, then leaders' characteristics will become reflected in their decisions and organizational performance. The relationship between leadership and organizational outcomes would be positive. However, if there is not much managerial discretion because of an aggressive board or chronic low performance as an organization, leaders' characteristics don't matter much. Hambrick and his team then introduced another moderator to explain the relationship between leaders' characteristics and organizational outcomes. This moderator is leader job demands. Even though leaders carry heavy workloads and operate under great pressure, the reality is that leaders' jobs differ widely in how difficult they are. For example, some leaders work in big organizations and have very capable team members, whereas other leaders have none of these cushions. Hambrick and his team argued that leader job demands come from three sets of factors: task challenges, performance challenges, and leaders' aspirations, such as strong personal desire to deliver maximum performance. As with managerial discretion, leader job demands can be an important moderator. Leaders who are under heavy job demands will be forced to take mental shortcuts and fall back on what they know. Therefore, their decisions will reflect their backgrounds and dispositions. On the other hand, leaders who face minimal job demands can afford to explore more options in their decision making. Therefore, their decisions will more greatly match the objective conditions they confront. Taken together, Hambrick and his team identified what were missing in the relationship between leadership and organizational outcomes. They then added two constructs, managerial discretion and leader job demands. They also introduced them as moderators, not mediators, to resolve the relationship between leaders' characteristics and organizational outcomes. To evaluate assumptions and identify what is missing in the existing theories, you'll need to read very extensively. Sometimes you'll need to read the literature that is not in your field to find innovative approaches. For example, scholars have used quantum theory to explain how billions of brain cells work together to generate consciousness. Scholars also conceptualize the organizational decision-making process is very similar to how brain cells generate a decision by a winner-takes-all approach. When you propose a new conceptualization that runs against the mainstream literature, you'll get pushback. I use the evidence from neuroscience to argue that data-driven decision-making may clash with moral decision-making. That manuscript was rejected multiple times. Well, the rejections I received are nothing compared to some scholars whose life was at risk. Galileo supported the theory that the sun, not the earth, is the center of the solar system. He was found guilty of heresy and was sentenced to life imprisonment. It took more than 300 years for the Catholic Church to clear his name. This is why replication is so important in science. The truth will eventually come out. Step number 6. Draft a graph to illustrate your theoretical framework, which includes the constructs and their relationships. A graph is not required in theoretical framework, but it can be very helpful for your readers to understand your ideas. A graph also helps you organize your own thoughts. In the graph, you'll need to show what theories or constructs you will study and explain how they relate to one another. An example is the graph we showed earlier that includes leadership, organizational outcomes, managerial discretion, and leader job demands. There are usually many theories and constructs relevant to your research questions. To select appropriate ones, you can use Griffith's 6 criteria to evaluate your choice of theories and constructs. They are feasibility, is there a good fit between the theory and the problem? Excitement, will the theory promote new insights or just reinforce old ones? Context, is the theory appropriate in the context of the current problem? And cost, can the individual afford to use the theory, especially in terms of time and effort? User-friendly, is the language of the theory understandable and enlightening? The last one is fruitful. Does the theory lead to problem solutions? Step number 7. Rewrite your research questions that include the constructs and the predicted relationships among the constructs. The last step is to rewrite your research questions. Go through step 1 to 6. You should be able to narrow down the theories and constructs you'd like to study in your empirical research. You should also have a better understanding of the relationships predicted by the theories. In this step, you'll need to make sure that your research questions are aligned with your theoretical framework. In doing so, you show how your research questions are driven by the theories, and the theoretical framework anchors how you collect the data, interpret your results, and how you justify the theoretical contribution to the field. In my last video, I talked about 5 criteria for good research questions in educational leadership. You can use those 5 criteria to evaluate the quality of your research questions. In this video, I introduced the 7 steps you can use to develop a theoretical framework for empirical research. Step number 1, write down your topic of interest, problem statement, and research questions. Step number 2, go to the literature and find relevant theories and constructs. Step number 3, find out what theories predict the relationships among the constructs. Step number 4, write down the assumptions of the theories listed above. Step number 5, do the assumptions hold? What is missing in the existing theories? What constructs need to be added to the existing theories? What roles do the added constructs play? Is the added construct a mediator or a moderator? Step number 6, draft a graph to illustrate your theoretical framework, which includes the constructs and their relationships. Step number 7, rewrite your research questions that include the constructs and the predicted relationships among the constructs. Following these 7 steps, you should be able to start building your theoretical framework. Not many scholars can build the theoretical framework with one trial. As you read more literature, you may need to refine it constantly. You may need to replace the added construct in step 5 with a different one. You may change the nature of the relationships among your constructs as you review more empirical evidence. This is why it took me 2 years to develop the theoretical framework of emotions in leaders' decision-making. Science is a trial and error process. Stay curious and never stop asking questions. What are your thoughts about how to develop a theoretical framework? Please leave your comments below. I'll see you next time.